Mix It with Mike plugin of the week comes from Inspired Acoustics. It's the Inspirata Pro plugin. There are four different versions of Inspirata. There's a light version, which I think gives you a single room, personal version, which gives you the stereo only, the Pro version, which I'm going to demonstrate here, which gives you surround capabilities up to 7.1.2, working with Dolby Atmos. And there is an immersive version of this, which goes up to 22.2. So you have loads of options. I'm not sure if it's classified as an impulse response because it's much, much, much more sophisticated than that. But for all of the different spaces that you get, you have about 200 gig worth of library of the sounds that sort of go into it. So what we have is a super high-end, sophisticated plugin that's designed for immersive applications and also actually happens to work incredibly well in studio use. So I've been using it for a bit here, kind of getting my hands around it, still clinging on to a few things, but it's really, really cool. So what you have is a whole series of spaces that you get when purchasing the plugin, everything from like a small rehearsal room, lots of churches, things like bedrooms and bathrooms. You get some performance halls, and you can sort them out into different categories here. You can line up yourself a series of favorites. I happen to like the underground garage, the basement rehearsal room. There's a few things in here that actually line up quite good. When you do select one, you just click on it. And then on the basic panel, what you'll see is a basic layout of what the space is like. You can actually direct the way that you're listening, so there's an option for that. You can actually dial through different spaces, so you can actually go through and it will set up some different spaces. And then it will give you the ability to kind of move things around within that space. Now, when you go to the fine-tune element here, then you'll have basically, you can have a whole series of sources. In this particular one, it comes defaulted up as two sources because you just have this one loaded up as a stereo in, stereo out. But you can move these positionally. So these would be the sound sources that you would be using, where the sound would be coming from, essentially. And then you have a listener position, which is right here. And there's a whole bunch of settings that work in and around that. So what happens is you move these sound sources around to different parts of the room, or you move the listening position to different out parts of the room. You'll get all different kinds of tonal characteristics and things that sound incredibly realistic. I mean, this is really an amazing sounding reverb program. It's hard to call it that because it seems like it's so much more than that. Now, when you go through it, it'll show your sources here. I'm going to show you more of a surround version a little bit for some of the examples, but the primary controls are all over here. So you could load up presets. That's a great way to getting you started here. You could store your own presets, all of that. So you could load up things that way. There's a little A/B. There's some settings in here, primarily where you store the library, and also some different settings that work with the filters here, which can work on the direct sound as well as the reverberant sound. There's a bypass, and primarily what you get input-output level, and then you have controls. Some of them you have to kind of dig into. Like there's a control here. Like, let's go over the normal ones here. Pre-delay, right? The amount of time between the direct sound and the reverberant sound, how long it takes there. So you have a little pre-delay standard thing there. A decay, right? So naturally this comes up with, I think, 0.8 seconds was this time. It might have been longer than that. It actually says right on there, and you can dial it back or forward, right? So you can make it longer by twice as much or half as long or quarter as long, according to this. So you have a little bit of that. The distance, so your relative distance in the room. So if I change this, you'll notice that it moves this position here as well. So you get that kind of control, right, where the two of them sort of work with each other. The clarity control sets out of a balance between the early reflection and the reverberant energy. That's the primary thing. That's probably the simplest way to explain it. The purity is a function that adds a little bit of high frequency to the early reflection to give it a bit more definition, so you hear a little bit more detail. You have the wet dry. You could take out any of the elements, the direct, early reflections, or late, so you could isolate them individually. There's a balance between the direct signal. Now, the direct signal is not the dry signal. The direct signal is how long it takes to get from the source to the microphone or the listening position. That's the direct sound. So it's the first wave of sound. That's the direct sound. Then it bounces off. It bounces off the surfaces. Those are early reflections initially, and then as it starts to build into more of a complex field of delays, then that becomes the reverberant energy. So those are the three primary parts, and then you can isolate those out there. All right, so we have those basic things here. When you get into some of this stuff gets into the particulars that make it really amazing and powerful. So you have spatial controls here, which allow you to set the apparent width of the source instrument. So if you have like a piano, you can make it really wide inside of a church and it sounds enormous. The listener envelopment, this would be like having, like if you imagine these as the microphones, this would be like a spaced pair versus a near coincident. That would basically be the difference there. The crosstalk cancellation is just a matter of like how much you want it to sound isolated, right? So it'll be more stereo, or how much you want them to sort of weave together as would be kind of natural in an acoustic space. So some basic things like there, you have gain controls for the direct, early reflections, and late. You have you have delays that you can set here. The natural one will give you what the natural acoustic environment is, and then there's other settings here that allow you to adjust it manually and stuff like that. This is different than pre-delay, and I'm not entirely clear how it's different, but it's a matter of being able to mess with the acoustic space. The manual is not exactly clear on a lot of things, so some of it, just trying to figure it out naturally, I don't want to leave the wrong impression. You can adapt the envelope, right? So you have things here that would allow you to change the shape of the reverberant field. You could control the early reflections. Again, you have the similar controls as what you have over here: purity, clarity. The transition is sort of the transition between early reflections and reverb, and how that sort of crosses over. And then the later reflections, you can actually start to play with and tilt the frequency response pattern to shape the tone of the room, plus change the overall reverb time from here as well. So you can see that works with the decay control, but you get something that's a bit more sophisticated with that control. All these have little reset functions that will set you back to normal. The directivity, this is an interesting one, because with this, it would be like your mic being figure of 8 versus omnidirectional. So you have some controls over here, and this will change the shape of the sound as it's coming to you. And then there's a speaker setup. This is a unique one because as I read it in the manual, it sort of aligns with the number of outputs, in this case 2, but you can go ahead and set up to 8 outputs, meaning that you could have essentially sound coming from 8 different places, and then you have the ability to sort of manipulate and move them around and sort of tie them in. And so this is sort of an interesting concept I don't fully understand, but it does sound amazing. So with all of this said, one of the primary things in terms of using it here, I'm just going to take that out, is just to show you what a basic rock drum kind of thing would be. So what I'm going to do here is I'm just going to take these guys, solo them up, and just give a little example of what that would be like. So here we go. All right, so let's see, how can let me just call up this. This will be my fader for that, just so I can mute it, just so you can hear what it's doing. Right, so you can see how that brings in a little bit more presence and snappiness to the drums. That's the purity again. It's bringing a little bit more high frequency into the early reflections. The clarity is another interesting one, which is more of the early reflection and reverberant energy balance. Oh, I can preserve the loudness here, which helps. So just that balance there, and then I can also set the transition, the way that they transition to each other, early reflections and late. Really beautiful clarity and separation. And as you go through all the different spaces, you could just spend hours really digging into it. Now, the apparent source width, this will give more immersive, like it'll make it sound like it'll get a lot more energy from the stereo-ness. So I'm not sure if that's the best way of describing it. More density of the reverb, I think, is probably a better way to describe it. This makes the source a little bit more discrete. And then the listener envelopment, here I'll just do it wider versus narrower. So you can see just with this and this one example how amazing, you can really get with this and how much control that you have over it. Not only that, you can actually do this per source. So I could pick the A source and set values for any of these settings as well. And this becomes important when you start to blend multiple sound sources going into the same reverb, which is a little bit of the example that I sort of want to push to next. Because there's a load of extra stuff that you get to. But just before that, I just want to kind of go over the speaker setup and show you a little bit about how this works. Right, so if I say went to something like a 5, let's go to 5.0 here. And it really starts to create this immersive feel. So there's nothing in their documentation about what it does, because this is all folding down to stereo, but it seems to create a lot of extra binaural information that seems to wrap around and create a lot more openness and space. Now, the one thing that was really super cool about this, and I just decided to play around with, was what I did was I decided to set up a full... I didn't do the .1, but I did basically a 7.0 input here. So we'll have 7 sound sources, and I just sort of set it up in a left, center, right, left side, left rear, right rear for the surrounds. And you can configure it and move them around any way that you want to. There's nothing that holds you to this. I think on another thing I was playing around with moving the different elements of the mix down in a configuration that was all in front of me versus sort of immersed around me. But what I could do with this then is if I then go ahead and create, let me just see here. So with the vocal here, I could then do something like create an actual surround feed for the vocal where I could place it anywhere that I want to. and in the middle, or I could feed out to individual things. So what I've done is I've taken, for example, the bass and just fed it to C. I fed the drums to C on one fader, set it on, this is sends rather, so this is sends feeding into a wet dry reverb, um, also into the left right, and then also into the left surround rear and the right surround rear, so that I could sort of get different blends on all the different elements, of the mix here. Let me just kind of move this out of the way so I could set different levels to sort of create the amount of immersion that I wanted to kind of go with this. And so I could move individual elements around. So essentially what I'm doing is with the different sends, I'm breaking it down where if I have essentially 7 inputs, I could feed any source to any one of those 7 inputs and have the reverb from the bass feel like it's emanating from a particular place in the room. Or decide that I want to engage a certain amount of reverberant energy, say from the kick and the snare, also from the rear of the room to make it seem bigger and fuller. And one of the things that I was playing around with this, and you could do it all with surround faders. I did it with individual inputs like this, and then I also did some surround things like you can see here for the guitars where I can place the guitar in a very specific location in the pan field. Feeding into this array that I've created here is that I wanted to see how well it would hold up if I just started to feed it in as if I were trying to put the entirety of a group of musicians and make it feel like I was in the space along with it. And so let's just have a quick listen to that, and we're just going to go for it and see what it sounds like. Here we go. Dilute me into a state of bliss. Offer me some peace and kind. Rectify my inconsolable. Fool attempts to throw you away. I've reconciled with hopes of change. It claws away at my carapace. This semblance of tender suffice yourself with all I have. Am So that whole thing is one reverb. So I've just put everything into one reverb. Now you could still use it whatever way that you want. You could still put 20 of them on there. It's amazing actually how efficient it is. And when you move things around within the field, actually this is off here. Should be in the middle. So hold on. Let's just do that demo again. So I think it'll sound a little bit better. Let me show you what it sounds like if I move it around. Legends with a sinking ship, dilute me into a state of bliss. Offer me some peace and kind, rectify my inconsolable. Fool attempts to throw you away. I've reconciled with hopes of change. It claws away at my carapace. This semblance of tender. So just the depth and the detail and the immersiveness of it is pretty amazing. And it's just a matter of getting used to the interface. It took me a little bit just to kind of set up the configuration, but I can always store this as a preset if I feel like I have something that I'm happy with. In the past, what I've always dealt with is taking if I wanted to create this sort of, hey, live at a club type of effect, would be as I would duplicate the identical reverb 5 or 6 times, and then I would optimize it, the settings for it, tweak it for the vocal, tweak it specifically for the drums, just to create those different depth field type of effects. And and you can make it work that way, and that way you don't have something that works for the drums but doesn't work for the vocal or doesn't work for the guitars. You're not stuck with one thing. You can sort of optimize it. But but this on its own sounds incredible. Just as from a starting, just like roughing something into place, and so it brings it to a completely different level. Now, the thing that I'm entirely not clear about, because I set up like a a seven setup, it's feeding to a stereo output. Like you can see the output right here. It's 7 channels in, but 1 channel out, or 2 channels out. Sorry, stereo. So it seems to be blending it back in some kind of binaural feed, or maybe that's just a byproduct of what happens when you set up and play with this. The flexibility with this is just completely insane. It's just so over the top, and your ability to dial in all kinds of tones from it is just ridiculous. I was just playing around for a while just with this, where you could take a sound, and if you move the source up against the wall, it starts to give you the buildup of resonances, and you can move it to different places in the room where you actually hear like probably the natural resonances of the room where there's a standing wave. It's just insane. I've never seen anything like this with this much flexibility. It just hands down, and maybe there is something out there. If there is, let me know. But it's pretty powerful, and when you start dialing in, it's very, very easy to get lost in it, and just how open and natural it sounds. And with everything going more towards immersive technologies, even if you're working entirely in stereo and you can achieve more immersive feeling effects on the work that you're doing, this to me is kind of a must-have in that realm. And this is just like a kind of very light touching on the capabilities. I could do a whole series of hour-long after hour-long after hour-long videos on all the little ways that you can use this when you dive in, because I'm just basically showing you one space more or less here. And it's pretty astounding what you can accomplish with that. So there you have it. There it is. Plugin of the week from Inspired Acoustics. Amazing work, and also a growing collection. There was only recently just an update where they added like another 6 or 8 rooms on top of that, and they're going to continue to do that. So when you purchase it, all of that just sort of continues to add to your collection. Really super cool. Inspirata Pro, this is the Pro version. There's an immersive version, which is more than this, more I/O sources. This all has Dolby Atmos capability, but even if you work with the stereo version, that's the personal edition. And then there's the light one if you just want to check it out for the minimum price. Great plugin. Really blown away by it. Inspired Acoustics, Inspirata Pro, excuse me. Plugin of the week.